On the evening of the 5th of May, 1980, television viewers watching the British news were astounded to see men dressed in black and wearing gas masks storm the Iranian embassy in London. They did so by bursting through upper floor windows. A few minutes later, they had overpowered the Iranian dissidents who had taken over the building and had rescued the hostages they were holding. It was the first time that the public at large had seen Britain's ace and highly secret Special Air Service in action. The SAS's roots go back to 1941, when British and Commonwealth forces were locked in battle with the Germans and Italians in the deserts of Egypt and Libya. David Sterling was a young commando officer recovering in hospital in Cairo from a parachuting accident. He had time on his hands to ponder on the general failure of Special Forces operations in the Middle East at that time. Sterling believed that attacks by small groups of men should be directed at airfields, supply dumps, and communications in order to disrupt the Axis forces. General Sir Claude Auchinleck, who had recently taken over command of the British forces in the Middle East, heard of Sterling's idea and liked it. He saw it as a useful adjunct to a major offensive that he was planning. Thus, in July 1941, L Detachment of the SAS Brigade came into being in Egypt. The title was to deceive the Axis into believing that a complete British airborne brigade was in the Middle East. The original SAS members were volunteers. One was 6'4" Irish rugby international Paddy Mayne, who already had a reputation for toughness. Another was a young Dane, Anders Lassen, who had already proved himself in the highly secret seizing of 3 Axis merchant vessels from a Spanish island off West Africa. Crusader, Auchinleck's offensive, had as its main object the relief of the Libyan port of Tobruk, which had been under siege since April. L Detachment's task was to destroy German fighters based on 5 forward airfields. Sterling and 63 other SAS men took part. Unfortunately, all landed in the wrong place, and only just over a quarter of them reached the rendezvous. A patrol of the Long Range Desert Group, the LRDG, brought them back to safety. As it did so, Auchinleck's long-awaited attack opened on the 18th of November. Eventually, after much bitter fighting, Tobruk was relieved. The LRDG specialized in long-range reconnaissance deep behind the Axis lines. Sterling now sought and obtained their help in inserting his men in future operations. This began to reap immediate results, and the SAS's tally of destroyed Axis aircraft rose dramatically. There were at the time 3 French forces fighting alongside the British in Libya. Sterling obtained volunteers from these, and they formed a French SAS squadron. In order to attack Axis ships unloading supplies from Europe at Libyan ports, Sterling took over a group of canoeists, who later formed the Special Boat Squadron. Towards the end of May 1942, Rommel attacked once more. This marked the beginning of 2 months of desperate fighting, which would see the British driven back almost to the gates of Cairo. It was during this time that the SAS carried out its most ambitious raid to date. The central Mediterranean island of Malta was crucial to British naval operations, but had been under constant air attack for more than a year. Its people were near starvation. In order to enable a vital supply convoy to get through to Malta, Sterling was asked to carry out raids on airfields deep behind the Axis lines. They were in the Derna and Benghazi areas, and also on Crete. The convoy sailed, but although the SAS destroyed some 50 aircraft, it was not enough to prevent the Luftwaffe from sinking several ships in it. In July 1942, the SAS acquired some American jeeps and armed them with twin Vickers K machine guns and a Browning .5-inch heavy machine gun. This was to be the SAS's main transport for the remainder of the war. On the night of the 23rd-24th of October 1942, Montgomery's 8th Army opened an offensive against Rommel at El Alamein. After 10 days of bitter resistance, the Axis forces had to withdraw. During the subsequent pursuit through Libya, the SAS played a useful role in harassing the Axis lines of communication. Indeed, when the British troops entered the Libyan capital of Tripoli in January 1943, they found that an SAS patrol had already arrived. By this time, a new campaign conducted by British, American and French forces had opened against the Axis in neighboring Tunisia. A second SAS regiment was formed to operate here. But conditions in Tunisia were very different to the desert, with its inevitable open flank, which made infiltration behind the Axis lines relatively easy. Now the Axis defenses were more cohesive, and the native population generally hostile. Indeed, disaster struck in January 1943, when Stirling set off with a patrol in order to link up with the Allied forces in Tunisia. German troops who'd been hunting the patrol captured him, and his active war came to an end. In April 1943, the final Allied offensive in Tunisia opened. But the loss of their leader and their recent relative lack of success raised increasing doubts over the SAS's future. The final Axis surrender in Tunisia saw the French squadron return to national command and the Special Boat Squadron detached for operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Rump, some 250 men under Paddy Mayne, played a distinguished and vital role in the British landings on Sicily in July 1943. Thereafter, the SAS fought behind the lines in Italy. Operating with Italian partisans, it maintained a campaign of disruption of German communications. In the meantime, the Special Boat Squadron, often in conjunction with a Greek equivalent, the Sacred Squadron, carried out numerous raids on German-held islands in the Aegean. They often used local craft for their operations. Thereafter, they operated in Greece and Yugoslavia. Finally, in April 1945, the SBS played an important part in the final Allied offensive in northern Italy. Here died the redoubtable Anders Lassen, who had become a legend in the SBS for his bravery. He was one of very few foreigners to be awarded Britain's highest decoration for bravery, the Victoria Cross. During the first months of 1944, the main attention of the Western Allies was focused on preparations for the cross-channel invasion of France. The SAS was reformed in Britain as a brigade, which included no less than 2 French regiments, besides 2 British regiments and a Belgian squadron. Their role was to cooperate with the French resistance and France's secret army, the Maquis. Some SAS groups parachuted into France just before D-Day. linked up with the resistance and helped to coordinate their attacks on the German lines of communication to Normandy. The majority dropped with their armed jeeps after the Allies were ashore and joined the Maquis. From the deep woods of central France, they caused havoc in the German rear areas. Once the Allies broke out of Normandy and throughout the remainder of the war in Europe, the SAS were at the forefront, constantly probing deep behind the German lines. On the 3rd of May 1945, they were the first Allied troops to enter the main German naval base at Kiel. But at the war's end, the SAS was disbanded. However, in 1948, the British Army found itself committed to a campaign against communist terrorists in Malaya. Locating their bases deep in the jungle proved difficult. A specialist deep penetration unit was therefore formed. In 1951, this became 22nd SAS Regiment and soon began to achieve results. They developed a method of parachuting into the dense jungle. Landing in the treetops, the SAS men learned to abseil down to the ground. Their patrols were prepared to remain in the jungle for up to 3 months at a time. This required enormous powers of endurance, both physical and mental, and self-discipline. By late 1958, the communist terrorist threat in Malaya had been almost eradicated. The SAS was now called upon to operate in a very different terrain, although it would once more use its jungle skills in Borneo during the mid-1960s, skills that it maintains to this day. The SAS's new area of operations was Oman, in the Arabian Peninsula, where the Sultan had asked for British help to deal with a rival. The SAS found themselves operating on the seemingly impregnable Jebel Akhdar plateau. In a masterly 2-month operation, the SAS succeeded in dominating this forbidding feature and overcame the opposition. SAS desert operations continued in the 1960s in the hinterland of Aden, before the British withdrawal from there in 1967. All this served to increase the SAS's desert skills. In the late 1960s, the Sultan of Oman came under threat once more, this time from communist-backed dissidents in the equally barren Dhofar region in the west. Once again, the SAS were called in and were given the task of raising and training Dhofari regulars, known as Fergats, to fight for the Sultan. As in other British counterinsurgency campaigns, winning over the people, what was called hearts and minds, was crucial. The SAS approach was based on the 4-man patrol, with each having a particular expertise. One man was a linguist, another well-versed in first aid, while the others were experts in communications and explosives. By the early 1970s, however, Middle East terrorism aimed largely at Israeli targets had become a serious threat. One of the main terrorist tactics was the hijacking of civil airliners. The SAS was tasked with producing techniques for overcoming these hijackers. Its success was only too clearly demonstrated in October 1977, when Palestinian terrorists hijacked a German Lufthansa airliner. The elite German GSG-9 anti-terrorist unit turned to the SAS for help. Accordingly, 2 of its members advised and helped the Germans in their storming of the aircraft at Mogadishu airport in Somalia, and the subsequent rescue of the passengers and crew. By now, the British Army was heavily engaged in Northern Ireland, mainly against Republican terrorists. Casualties had been mounting from ambushes and booby traps. Helicopters became the only safe means of transport in some areas. The threat was the same on the streets of Belfast and other urban areas. In 1976, the SAS was called in, primarily to gain intelligence on the terrorists. One method it used was for its men to operate from skillfully constructed and cleverly camouflaged hides. From these, they could watch a particular house or a newly discovered arms cache. They would remain in these hides for days at a time. Sometimes the SAS was able to mount skillful ambushes, as in May 1987, when an SAS patrol shot dead 8 IRA terrorists who were attacking a police station at Loch Gall, County Armagh. The IRA did everything in its power to discredit the SAS, and no more so than after the controversial shooting in March 1988 of 3 terrorists who were planning to blow up a British Army band with a car bomb in one of Gibraltar's main squares. In 1995, the European Court of Human Rights absolved the SAS men involved of any criminal act. The hijacking of the Iranian embassy by gunmen in May 1980 developed into a siege which the police were unable to break. Once the SAS were called in, they demonstrated another of their newly acquired skills, the storming of buildings containing hostages. Careful planning, detailed rehearsals, and superb teamwork enabled the SAS to end the siege with the minimum loss of life. The unwanted publicity created an upsurge of volunteers wanting to join the SAS. This is by no means easy. Every applicant carries out a lengthy selection course, which is based on orienteering exercises in Wales's rugged Brecon beacons. These are tests of increasing endurance, with the student carrying an ever heavier load on his back. They're designed to test the volunteer's mental just as much as his physical fitness. The SAS is looking for the quietly determined and well-rounded individual, and not the loud-mouthed bully. Such are its demanding standards that only some 10% pass the selection course. Among the skills that the SAS soldier learns is free-fall parachuting as a means of entering enemy-occupied territory without being spotted. Once in hostile territory, the SAS man is trained to live off the land, foraging for his own food. Indeed, he's taught the skills of the butcher. He learns to construct and live in hides of many types.
And you now can see the structure that's inside. What you've done is you've dug down approximately 2 feet.
He must be able to evade enemy troops who come searching for him. If an SAS man is captured, he's well trained to resist all forms of interrogation. The 1982 Falklands War saw the SAS once more distinguish themselves, along with their counterparts, the Special Boat Squadron, now part of the Royal Marines. Long before the task force arrived, SAS teams had been covertly landed on the islands. One group was given a task identical to that for which the SAS had originally been formed. This was to attack an Argentinian airstrip on offshore Pebble Island and destroy the Pucara ground attack aircraft based there, as this reconstruction shows. This helped the task force accomplish the initial landings without serious opposition. Once it was ashore, SAS observation posts proved invaluable in obtaining details of Argentinian deployments. They also directed British guns onto targets. Such is the caliber of the SAS that their commander in the Falklands would, as General Sir Michael Rose, be the United Nations commander in Bosnia 12 years later. Another distinguished SAS officer, General Sir Peter de la Billière, commanded the British forces engaged in the 1991 Gulf War. Here it was the SAS's desert skills which were called upon. One vital task which coalition aircraft undertook was the destruction of Scud missile launchers. These were firing missiles at both Saudi Arabia and Israel and were proving difficult to locate. Indeed, the Israelis threatened to launch their own attacks on Iraq, which would have threatened the cohesion of the coalition. SAS patrols penetrated deep into Iraq in order to locate the mobile launchers and to disrupt Iraqi communications. The SAS too has been used in troubled Bosnia to help monitor the fighting there and to locate heavy weapons threatening the designated UN safe areas. Thus, the SAS is as busy as it ever has been, and its wide-ranging skills reinforce its standing as one of the world's leading elite units. Whatever challenges face the SAS in the future, its men will meet them as they always have done, and live up to their motto, "Who dares, wins."